We're rolling.
We finished up cross-examination of the officer that was on the stand yesterday. The cross-examination went really well. In his testimony, he would not admit that what happened was a protest. He said, from my vantage point, from what I saw, because of the number of weapons, because of the way that people postured, because of their clothing even, he said, to me, that was not a protest. Stephen Stewart's attorney in cross-examination said, I would like to take you back to a report that you wrote 2 days after the incident where he described it as a protest. That happened to the second federal agent that was on the stand today during cross-examination. He testified to the exact same thing. This was not a protest. His memorandum, they called it memorandum of activity. His memorandum of activity submitted 3 days after the event on the 12th. He described it multiple times as a protest. Todd Engel, so far, we're on day 6 of the trial. Todd Engel is absolutely batting 1,000. He cross-examined the federal agent today and got this federal agent to admit that from his vantage point, he was able to see federal agents with their weapons raised. Because up to this point, every federal agent that has gotten on the stand has said no federal agent raised a weapon at protesters. And Todd Engel's examination from that federal agent's vantage point, he got him to admit that he was able to see weapons raised. That was absolutely critical, and it was a home run for these guys that are on trial. During the trial, there's a lot of discussion around what's called Post 1 and Post 2. So Interstate 15 is a north to south interstate, but at the section that the two-cop wash is in, it actually runs east to west. So the southbound lane is running on the north side, the northbound lane is on the south side, and there were 2 posts. Post number 1 was the southbound lane just as you pass the two-cop wash and turn right, there's a big pullout. That was post number 1. Post number 2 was the area that we've all seen in the videos. It was the gate set up underneath the southbound bridge. This particular agent, his name was Mike Johnson, he was initially staged at post 1 because they were concerned about the crowd that was gathered. He was there for 15 minutes. They moved him back and he was 30 to 40 yards back, standing next to a generator with a light pole. And he testified that from his vantage point, he observed a sniper and a spotter. During cross-examination, they said, well, how far away were they? Oh, at least 200 yards, probably more. How did you observe this? He had a pair of 8-power binoculars. I think it was either Jackson or Perez for Loveling or Burleson. During cross-examination, stood up and said, how do you know that this was a spotting scope? How do you know that this was a range-finding scope that a spotter would use for a sniper? And he said, well, it was about this big, and I saw him hold it up to his face. And the attorney says, well, have you ever seen a camcorder? And the gentleman said, yes, but he held it up to his face. And he said, well, why would he hold it to his face? He said, well, because it's got a little eyepiece. He said, haven't you ever seen a camcorder that has a small eyepiece? The gentleman said, yes. He said, so it's possible that it was a camcorder that the man was holding. He said, yes, it's possible. With regard to the sniper that he saw, during cross-examination, Jess Marchese for Eric Parker stood up and said, you testified that you saw a sniper take cover behind a barrier. And he said, that's correct. He said, so what did you observe him do behind that barrier? Silence. He said, you couldn't see him once he dropped down behind that barrier, could you? And he said, no, I could not. So today, the government is really going hard after making sure that this is not described as a protest. They've objected during cross-examination if defendants call it a protest. So defendants have moved during cross-examination to make sure that they bring up these memorandums that these agents wrote. These are their official reports, and multiple times they described it at that time as a protest. Another interesting tidbit is that none of them wrote reports on the day of the 12th, and one in fact testified that he didn't even make any notes. He had barely had 1 to 2 hours of sleep. He was exhausted during the entire operation. They packed up, they left what they're calling the ICP, the Incident Command Post. He left, he made no notes. It was not until 2 or 3 days later, after he had had time to confer with other agents, that they made their reports. And in these reports, they referred to it as a protest.
So what is the government trying to call the demonstrations?
They're not categorizing it anything. The agents that are on the stand reference it as the event that happened on April 12th. So the witnesses so far have not gone as far as to call it an assault like the government has during all their motions and filings. But they are also really pushing back on allowing anyone to call it a protest. And the agents, when they testify, the reason that they say this was not a protest is because people had guns. As far as they could see, there were all kinds of guns. And they have testified that most of them were properly holstered, or the long guns that they saw, for the most part, were slung. So
that's why it was a successful protest.
A successful protest. One attorney got up and said, "You wouldn't categorize this as a protest." And he said, "No, I would not." He said, "Did you see any flags?" And he thought for a second. He said, "I can't recall." The attorney says, "Do you know what a flag looks like?" And of course there was an objection, argumentative, and he had to end his line of cross-examination.
Do you know what a horse looks like?
One has to wonder. At this point, like I said, Todd Engel's cross-examination was compelling enough for the attorney that examined that witness to re-examine and to go back and try to clarify things in their favor, what Todd Engel had got the man to admit. Most notably, that they did in fact raise weapons in the direction of the wash, which these agents have categorically denied up to this point that anybody raised the weapon.
Really?
Todd Engel got this man to admit on the stand that from his vantage point at the generator, which was just north of post number 1, from where he couldn't see into the wash between the bridges, but he could see down just up to the gate. And from that vantage point, he was able to see agents with their weapons raised. So it was, I think it was a tough day for families, because these witnesses are getting into describing things like snipers and spotters, and defense attorneys are coming back and they're planting the seed of reasonable doubt. They're really not going after these guys yet. I think they'll hit them in closing statements. But for now, they've been able to sufficiently create doubt that their testimony, at least, is 100% accurate. They were all sleep deprived because of what happened, and they did not write their reports until 3 days later.
So they got to see the sleep deprivation was caused from what happened a few days before.
The sleep deprivation happened. We found out today that the government took 4 agents from an investigative unit and they put them in plain clothes and they started sending them to the rallies that happened off of State Road 170.
Okay.
And what one agent testified today, that from the rally on the 7th, he didn't see anything out of the ordinary. In fact, they were there helping set up the stage and hang banners. They were intricately involved. Wow. They were there talking to people. They were able to point out Ricky Loveling as having been present at the demonstration on the 7th at the rally. But from what they saw at the 7th, they weren't concerned. They called it anti-government, anti-federal agency rally, but otherwise there was nothing they were concerned about. They said from the 7th to the 11th, the situation changed substantially. And all of a sudden, people at rallies were there with guns. And the Bundys had ratcheted up this terrible rhetoric that caused them all to fear that the incident command post, which is where the cattle were being held just north of the southbound bridge, they were concerned now that because of what they saw on the 11th, that the incident command post would be overrun. That caused them to collapse their perimeters, and they immediately caused people to work double shifts. This was starting the 11th sometime in the evening. So people that had already been on shift all day on the 11th were not allowed to go off shift. They were to stay on shift. They worked all the way through the 11th, through the night, into the 12th, when the protest happened under the wash. So they were exhausted. They packed up in a hurry when they decided to leave, and none of them bothered to write a report until they had had time to confer with other agents, and presumably until they had had time to view the national media coverage that happened, because the other thing that was pointed out through these memorandums, especially the officer in post number 1 who stood behind the generator, that testified that he saw a sniper and a spotter, that never surfaced in his written report. It was nowhere to be found in the written report that happened 3 days after the incident. But now, 3 years later, on the stand in front of a jury, now he remembers a sniper. And these attorneys, they're going after it hard, but it's subtle right now. They're planting the seed of doubt with the jury, I think, to discredit this, and I think they'll hit that home when it comes to closing arguments.
Yeah, it sounds like a false testimony entirely.
We were concerned yesterday with Special Agent Stover. He was the assistant special agent in charge. He worked directly for Dan Love. He was asked a couple of really compelling questions. Notably, he was asked, did you see anyone raise a weapon at the wash? And it took him about 40 seconds to answer that. And he said, I do not recall. And we've all seen photos of agents with weapons raised. So we were a little bit concerned about that. And of course, we all know, we're all aware of the ethics violations surrounding Special Agent in Charge Dan Love.
Get a stronger signal.
We're all aware of the issues with Special Agent Dan Love. They're trying to see if that man had any influence on any of his subordinates, because in the ethics inquiry to his involvement at Burning Man in 2015, he tampered with witnesses. He coerced his subordinates to tell the Department of Interior that they did not recall, even if they did.
Really?
And he threatened one agent, pseudo-threatened, told her that if she testified against him, that a grenade would go off and she would be hit. That was all in the ethics testimony. They're really trying to tie these agents to see what involvement Dan Love might have had. Special Agent Stover was specifically asked, if Daniel Love were to commit a crime or do something illegal, would you report him? And the man said absolutely. They then asked Agent Stover, if Daniel Love was to do something unethical, would you report it? And he paused for a few seconds, and he said, well, define ethical. Is it like in a social setting or professional? And they said, no, a professional setting, he does something against agency policies. Would you report this man? And Special Agent Stover stopped. He paused for a second, and he says, I would like to think that I would. Couldn't give a straight answer. So they're really working to see what element of influence Daniel Love has had in this. And that's the line of testimony that they have now. The gentleman on the stand this afternoon was one of the gentlemen who was undercover. They were sent in to the rallies, and it was from the rally on the 11th that they decided, because of the presence of guns and because of people in camouflage, it elevated their threat assessment so high that they decided to end the roundup operation. And from their perspective, they felt like they were going to be overrun. That's the narrative coming from agents.
Now that agent that testified, was his face visible, or was he behind a screen? Or
all of the agents so far have been on the stand, have been visible. Their names have been read. The names of their co-workers have been read. There was one incident where an attorney started to read a list of names from a document that's sealed, and the judge shut that down pretty quick. So everything that we've heard pretty quick.
Has anyone talked to him?
Has it been brought out in court that the sheriff of Clark County told them to put it down before it started?
Okay, so Special Agent Mike Johnson, he was the one that was at post number 1 that moved back to behind. He moved behind the generator. Special Agent Johnson testified from his vantage point. He could see Nevada Highway Patrol on the bridge, just walking around, mingling with people. And he said to this day he's confused as to why that happened. During cross-examination, they tried to make the point, if Nevada Highway Patrol wasn't concerned with their lives, why were you 200 yards away? Why were you so concerned 200 yards away?
I heard that the sheriff had already told him to stand down prior to the demonstration.
Todd Engel brought that up in cross-examination. He said, did you hear Tom Roberts tell you to sling or hide your long guns? He said, I did not hear that. Did you hear that come over the radio? Special Agent Johnson has testified that he did not hear that. So at some point, if that exists in discovery, that's certainly going to surface, because Special Agent Stover testified that his threat assessment of the situation elevated substantially when Ammon Bundy was tased. And he said, and one of the attorneys stood up and asked about that specific incident. And he said, well, who do you think the aggressor was? That was paraphrasing. That was the line of questions. He says, well, Ammon Bundy kicked that dog in the head, and that's why they sicked it on it. They immediately pulled up the video, and they were able to show an agent point and deploy the dog At which point, Ammon Bundy kicked to defend himself.
self-defense.
Exactly. So they were able, with video, to get that agent to say, "I guess I was wrong."
Well, I heard that the sheriff had already informed Bureau of Land Management to shut down prior to the demonstration.
So the Bureau of Land Management is saying that they decided on the 11th, because of their threat assessment, to end the roundup. However, the cattle that they had there, this is the BLM,
Right.
they say belongs to them, and that they, at that point, were going to take the cattle they had and move along. But because things escalated, especially when the crowd of demonstrators and protesters gathered on the 12th, they thought they were going to, quote, be overrun. So that's where we're at this afternoon. We'll keep going with cross-examination of this witness who was an undercover operative there.
Never get these undercovers disclosed.
It is. Yep. There were 4 of them. We know who 2 of them are.
This has been a real issue with a lot of us. We've talked to them.
Exactly. Nope. They were right there at the rallies. They were helping set up the stage. They were helping hang banners. They were right there.
They could have been right next to us. You know what I mean?
So that's all we've got for this afternoon. We'll get you guys something at the conclusion today if there's anything substantive, and we'll keep everyone updated.
Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Awesome.